I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. With Joseph Smith's presidential campaign still kind of at the early stages, the propaganda machine of Nauvoo was in full force. As articles circulated revealing the finer points of the Mormon theocratic kingdom, articles from Nauvoo were devised in response. I offer as an example of this an article that was published as a letter to the editor of the New York Tribune. This article caused a significant amount of public attention to be focused on the Mormon kingdom. It is a remarkable article, but the resulting propaganda and public's response to the article is even more fascinating to me. To preface the article, it's almost as if the person was a local of one of the neighboring towns of Nauvoo. They had heard the constant rhetoric from the prophet and his cronies and devised an exact and direct response to each point that they frequently made. We'll discuss what each of those points are as we go through the article. It begins, quote, "To the editor of the New York Tribune, I take my pen today to give you some account of the Mormons and their prophet, about whom much is said abroad and but little is known." Well, hang on, let's pause right there. For the very first point that this article attempts to deal with is the economic growth the area is experienced as a result of the Mormon refugee crisis. And this was a constant mainstay of Joe's rhetoric, how industrious the Mormons are. Whether it was from the pulpit or published in the Times and Seasons or published in the Nauvoo Neighbor or in letters to people who are considering migrating to Nauvoo from anywhere else in America or in Europe, the economy in Nauvoo under Joe's inspired leadership was better than it had ever been. Ignore the unemployment, the insane inflation, and inability of people to afford housing. Joe's economy was the strongest it had ever been. Nauvoo's place on a jetty into the Mississippi placed it in the most favorable location in America, and the whole area was reaping the benefit of Mormon industry, at least according to the rhetoric. Quote, "No one acquainted with this section of the country since 1837 can realize the extent to which its prosperity has been impeded by the settlement of the Mormons amongst us on leaving the scenes of their difficulties in Missouri. That section of country, embracing an extent of 50 miles, having the Des Moines Rapids and the city of Nauvoo for its center, possesses natural advantages, in my opinion, not equaled by any other of similar extent in the Mississippi Valley. At the date alluded to, this region was rapidly filling up with an enterprising, moral, and intelligent population. Now, since the sojourn here of the ragamuffin imitation of Muhammad and his servile followers, an effectual stop has been put to emigration, excepting, indeed, such as is intended to swell the number of adherents to the fortunes of the prophet. And it is not unreasonable that it should be so. It is not expected that peaceable and inoffensive citizens would desire for their neighbors a set of fanatics, whose fundamental doctrine is that the earth and its good things are theirs, and that they will shortly inherit them, many of whom are not willing to await their appointed time, but proceed to take their portion from the Gentiles in advance." End quote. So this passage in the article deals with the rhetoric that Nauvoo was a safe and secure place to visit. The Mormon leadership were criminals, and they were using the Nauvoo municipal court system to cover up rampant theft and robbery that was happening all over town. In accordance with Joe's Missouri revelations in 1833 and 1838, the Mormons were taking the property of the Gentiles, or the non-Mormons, and they were consecrating that property to the church. A point that I neglected to make last week about the Book of the Law of the Lord, or the Baal, that has to do with this. People consecrated or tithed property to the temple construction during 1841 and through 44, and hundreds of contribution records follow page after page throughout the Baal. Well, there was nothing stating that the Mormons had to contribute their own property to the temple, just that any property could be consecrated to the building of the temple. So with this interpretation of the evidence, some of the lines denoting material consecrations to the temple that's contained in the Baal could actually be used as evidence of theft by the Mormons. I've actually never seen a study done on this, and I don't suspect one has been done yet because the bylaw was only open to research like 4 years ago, but I wonder if it might be possible to match the criminal records of theft and robbery in and around Nauvoo with items donated or quote-unquote consecrated to the Book of the Law of the Lord. How interesting would that be? A Nauvoo municipal court is held for theft of a trunk of clothes and a saddle. The accused are acquitted by Joseph Smith, and then 2 days later, there's an entry in the Book of the Law of the Lord for some clothes and a saddle. Quite interesting. Food for thought, maybe. Let me know if you've seen any research on this. nakedmormonism@gmail.com. In any case, this person who wrote this op-ed to the New York Tribune goes on to talk about the average member not being the villainous knave that is the prophet. Quote, I am far from casting reproach upon the whole body of the Mormon people. There are doubtless many exemplary and estimable citizens among them, whose chief aim is to live righteously, soberly, and godly in this present world. Their greatest failing is in that they are yielding too implicit obedience to the mandates of a most wicked and corrupt man. But after an intercourse of 6 or 7 years with numbers of the sect, the unwilling conviction has been forced upon me that a large number of them are evil-disposed men. Men who, like their leaders, embraced Mormonism for the sake of more effectively preying upon their fellow men. End quote. This is a super interesting point in my eyes. People who are just genuinely bad people saw Mormonism as a land of refuge and opportunity, and they would join in order to prey on their fellow men, or on their women in many cases. You see, Mormonism did provide some interesting and appealing propositions to those who were, let's just say, less scrupulous in their personal ethics. Lots of money to be made, women to be sealed to in the new and everlasting covenant, and of course a banana republic legal system to protect the guy from any legal troubles. Joe surrounded himself with these people. Each member of the High Council was less moral than the previous. None of them were idiots. It's no wonder that folks like John C. Reckett Bennett and Joseph H. Jackson made their way up the leadership ranks so quickly in order to gather information for their exposés. Bad men tend to congregate like dragging a magnet through dirt, and Joe was the worst of them all, which is where the focus to which this article next turns its ire. Quote, of the prophet himself, none who know him can respect him. They cannot respect him for his sincerity, for he cannot be sincere. He cannot be the victim of his own delusion. They cannot esteem him for his piety, for he does not even profess to be pious. And he is notoriously the greatest blasphemer and railer in the country. They cannot respect him for his talents, for he has none. He is uneducated and ignorant, possessing no more of the qualifications for a great reformer as he professes to be than can be found in 50 grog shop loafers in your city. Let me assure you and your readers that this man is much more indebted to circumstances for the unenviable position he occupies than to any ability of his own. He has obtained a strong ascendancy over mass of mind, uneducated and vicious as it undoubtedly is. For this, as I have said, he is indebted to circumstances, and by the force of these circumstances alone he is able to maintain it. His own people do not love or respect him. Many are jealous of his power, and only submit to it because their present interest seems to require it. Even Sidney Rigdon, who has been the main pillar of Mormonism in its earlier days, I am assured is only waiting for a favorable opportunity to withdraw. End quote. Obviously, this article is painting with pretty broad brushstrokes, but it should be notable that life wasn't great for a lot of Nauvoo Mormons. A core of unyielding sycophants may have painted the illusion that every one of the 15,000 people living in the area venerated Joe as their king on earth. But a lot of people sacrificed a lot to be a member of this church, which understandably left many of them jaded by what had happened to them. The article also claims that Joe had created a system of vicious competition, which has certainly survived in the Salt Lake Temple, church today, and that some of his purported loyal leadership were actually just waiting for the opportunity to either leave or to ascend to the presidency themselves. This system of competition, understandably, came as a result of the carrot and stick approach that Joe had to leadership. You're loyal and you help the church out, you gain the prophet's favor and plenty of worldly comforts. You're an enemy of the church or a dissenter against the prophet, you suffer his wrath, and may even enjoy a nice late-night visit from a Danite like Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell. Continuing, quote, in Smith centers all power, spiritual and temporal. He is prophet, priest, president, an office in the church, general, mayor of the city, and landlord. The organization of the city under a charter obtained from the legislature of Illinois is complete. They have a city council who acts are but the echo of the prophet's will. I send to you 2 specimens of their legislation. Both are now in full force in the city. First, an extra ordinance for the extra case of Joseph Smith and others. And it includes preamble recounting Smith's difficulties in Missouri. And then it has Section 1. Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo, according to the intent and meaning of the charter for the benefit and convenience of Nauvoo, that hereafter, if any person or persons shall come with process, demand, or requisition founded upon the aforesaid Missouri difficulties to arrest said Smith, he or they shall be subject to be arrested by any officer of the city with or without process, and tried by the municipal court upon testimony, and if found guilty, sentenced to imprisonment in the city prison for life, which convict or convicts can only be pardoned by the governor with the consent of the mayor of said city. Passed December 8th, 1843, signed Joseph Smith, Mayor, and Willard Richards, Recorder. The article provides a very brief commentary before talking about the next ordinance. What beautiful legislation! The pardoning power taken from the governor, and life imprisonment under a city ordinance. Here is another less dangerous one. An ordinance for the health and convenience of travelers and other persons. Section 1. Be it ordained by the City Council of Nauvoo that the mayor of the city be and is hereby authorized to sell or give spirits of any quantity, and he in his wisdom shall judge to be for the health, comfort, or convenience of such travelers or other persons as shall visit his house from time to time. Passed December 12th, 1843, signed Joseph Smith, Mayor, and Willard Richards, Recorder. Then the article commentary is, the sole intent of this ordinance is to give the mayor of the city, Joseph Smith, who it will be recollected is a tavern keeper, a monopoly of retailing liquors to travelers and others without license. End quote. Did you know that Joseph Smith had wine and tobacco brought to him when he was in the Carthage jail? That's a frequent, quote-unquote, anti-Mormon talking point some of you may have heard or have used at some point. Well, Joseph Smith also passed laws as mayor that he was the only person who could sell alcohol in the entire city of Nauvoo, and his police force vigorously enforced these laws. Joe didn't just drink alcohol in opposition to the word of wisdom. He made sure that he was the only guy in Nauvoo who could legally sell it, and he used his position as mayor of the city to set himself on top of the alcohol monopoly in the city. If folks wanted to get alcohol at prices which weren't exorbitant from Joseph Smith, they'd have to travel about 15 miles to the nearest grog shop, which wasn't in the city jurisdiction of Nauvoo. In a car, that's no big deal, but in a wagon or carriage, that's quite a burdensome requirement if you want to get a little tipsy. Joe was in kind of a dangerous position in Nauvoo. I mean, he could make the rules to the game of reality and play however he wanted to. He made the rules allowing him to act any way he wanted to, and following the rules was even elective for him, but everybody else had to play by his rules of his game. We see how a lack of checks and balances like this can be very, very dangerous to the regular order of law. We have a system set up and a general social contract of abiding by that system and not breaking it. Then a guy comes along and flaunts those social contracts. He makes his own rules, and we're all left with our hands up in the air wondering what the hell to do to get rid of them. But the thing is, Joseph Smith had long since ruled that he couldn't be impeached, and his cabal of legitimately loyal, sycophantic leadership had made sure that power resided solely in him. This power, if non-usurpation and absolutely being unimpeachable, it worked for him until the only remaining solution was vigilante justice, which was, let's just say, swift and far too late. Final paragraph from this person who traveled to Nauvoo and published this op-ed in the New York Tribune. Quote, "Should the temple ever be finished on the plan originally contemplated, it would be the most magnificent building in the West, but it will not be finished. At the rate it has progressed since its foundation stone was laid, it will require 20 years to complete it, and a sum of money not far short of $500,000. I have good grounds for the opinion that large sums bestowed for that purpose never have been or will be expended on that splendid monument of folly and wickedness. Yours, signed Westward Ho." End quote. So, this article that we just went through was published in the New York Tribune in late January of 1844 and was reprinted all across the country for the months of February and March while Joe was putting the word out about his presidential campaign. The cogs of the Nauvoo propaganda machine began to churn, and the Times and Seasons printed an article which was, let's just say, supposedly written by somebody who happened to travel to Nauvoo and write a good Yelp review of the city and its prophet, mayor, general, tavern keeper, apropos of nothing, of course. Now, I'll tell you, this article we're about to read, it reads a lot like William Wine's Double Dub Phelps wrote it, as he was one of Joe's primary propaganda officers. But reading word prints like this with such little data and nearly infinite well of possible authors means that I have no way of proving that Double Dub Phelps actually wrote this. We're reading it from the History of the Church, the Dan Vogel Source and Text Critical Edition, Volume 6, beginning on page 298. Quote, "A traveler, having visited Nauvoo for a few days, wrote to the Times and Seasons, 'Nauvoo, Mansion, March 1844. Mr. Editor, before I take my departure, permit me to express my views relative to the leading men of your city where I have been these few days. I have been conversant with the great men of the age, and last of all, I feel that I have met with the greatest in the presence of your esteemed prophet, General Joseph Smith. From many reports, I had reason to believe him a bigoted religionist, as ignorant of politics as the savages. But to my utter astonishment, on the short acquaintance, I have found him as familiar in the cabinet of nations as with his Bible, and in the knowledge of that book I have not met his equal in Europe or America. Although, if I should beg leave to differ with him in some items of faith, his nobleness of soul will not permit him to take offense at me. No, sir, I find him open, frank, and generous, as willing others should enjoy their opinions as to enjoy his own. The general appears perfectly at home on every subject, and his familiarity with many languages affords him ample means to become informed concerning all nations and principles, which his familiar and dignified deportment towards all must secure to his interest, the affections of every intelligent and virtuous man that may chance to fall in his way. And I am astonished that so little is known abroad concerning him. Martin Van Buren was my favorite, and I was astonished to see General Smith's name as a competitor, but since my late acquaintance, Mr. Van Buren can never reseat himself in the presidential chair on my vote while General Smith is in the field. Forming my opinions alone of the talents of the two from what I have seen, I have not reason to doubt, but General Smith's integrity is equal to any other individual, and I am satisfied that he cannot easily be made the pliant tool of any political party. I take him to be a man who stands far aloof from the little caucus quibblings and squabblings, while nations, governments, and realms are wielded in his hands as familiarly as the top and hoop in the hands of their little masters. Free from all bigotry and superstition, he dives into every subject, and it seems as though the world was not large enough to satisfy his capacious soul, and from his conversation one might suppose him as well acquainted with other worlds as this. So far as I can discover, General Smith is the nation's man, and the man who will exalt the nation if people will give him the opportunity, and all parties will find a friend in him so far as right is concerned. General Smith's movements are perfectly anomalous in the estimation of the public. All other great men have been considered wise in drawing around them wise men, but I have frequently heard the general called a fool because he has gathered the wisest of men to his cabinet who direct his movements. But this subject is too ridiculous to dwell upon. Suffice it to say, so far as I have seen, he has wise men at his side, superlatively wise, and more capable of managing the affairs of a state than most men now engaged therein, which I consider much to his credit, though I would by no means speak diminutively of my old friends. From my brief acquaintance, I consider General Smith, independent of his peculiar religious views, in which, by the by, I have discovered neither vanity nor folly, the sine qua non of the age to our nation's prosperity. He has learned the all-important lesson to profit by the experience of those who have gone before, so that, in short, General Smith begins where other men leave off. I am aware this will appear a bold assertion to some, but I would say to such, call and form your acquaintance as I have done, then judge. Thus, sir, you have a few leading items of my views of General Smith, formed from personal acquaintance, which you are at liberty to dispose of as you think proper. I anticipate the pleasure of renewing my acquaintance with your citizens at a future day. Yours respectfully signed, a traveler. End quote. Such a resounding approval of Joseph Smith of Nauvoo and the Mormons at large would have been welcome news for anybody keeping up with the Mormon controversy on the national scale, or maybe it would have struck them as the propaganda that it actually was. Who knows how this article struck people when they read it? I would also point out here that the Times and Seasons had a few thousand regular readers who possibly read this traveler's article response letter to the editor. Maybe the letter was picked up by another newspaper, but it's kind of doubtful. However, the number of readers who saw the New York Tribune article about the Mormon villainy was probably a few 100,000 nationwide, especially with the reprinting of that article in other outlets. For context, there were about 2.5 million people living in the state of New York in the 1840s, and a lot of them read the New York Tribune. More people knew about how bad the Mormons were than there were people who held them in high regard. Even so, that New York Tribune article generated some skepticism from others who sent letters to editors of newspapers which had reprinted the article. The Quincy Whig, for example, published a response to some of the pushback that they received from citizens after they reprinted the New York Tribune article who didn't hold such caustic views of the Mormons. From the Quincy Whig, quote, "Some of our Mormon friends, or rather acquaintances, we suppose we should call them, are exceedingly wrathy, because we published an article in our last paper from the New York Tribune, reflecting in somewhat severe terms upon the leaders of the Mormons. We are sorry that we cannot please them, but having made up our mind to publish all that the cause of truth demands in exposition of Smith's blasphemy, hypocrisy, and political proceedings, generally, whenever we deem it necessary and proper to the public good, we shall not turn aside from our duty in consequence of the frowns or threats of any one or dozen men." Good. The Quincy Whig was committing to journalistic integrity, even in the face of as much public pushback that they received for printing this article. It continues. "We have no religious or sectarian prejudices to gratify in exposing the conduct of the Mormon leaders. We should pursue the same course towards any other denomination calling themselves Christians were the leaders of the same guilty of attempting to unite religious and political power together under the control and at the behest of a leader whose morals as a religious teacher, as a politician, as an official magistrate, and as a man were of so doubtful and questionable character as Smith's." It's a good point. It doesn't matter that the Mormons, if any denomination, Christian or not, led by somebody like Joseph Smith, we would publish the same about them. That's a really strong point and really speaks to the Quincy Whig. When such a man has influence in the land and is leading thousands of perhaps honest, though deluded individuals into a position that must bring upon them misery, wretchedness, and 1,000 other ills, it is time for the press to speak out and expose the knavery and hypocrisy of such a man. We shall not, of course, devote much of our paper to the Mormon controversy now raging in Hancock County, but we shall on necessary occasions publish such matter referring thereto as will best, as we believe, serve the cause of truth, humanity, and the rights of other citizens. This Mormons and all others may rely upon. We are informed at a church meeting of this people in our city on Sunday last, one or two of their speakers took the opportunity to denounce our paper in the strongest language for publishing the article referred to above. This was hardly in the character of Christians as they claim to be. If they were persecuted, as they assert, the good book teaches them to bear all such things with patience and an enduring spirit, instead of indulging in wrathy denunciations and exhibiting a bitter and vindictive feeling. This last is too much in the character of Muhammad, such as their leader desires to be if he had only the men and money." End quote. Now, that last part, all of that response, it was true. The Mormon leadership renewed a crusade against the Quincy Whig and other newspapers in the next public meeting when Joe said, quote, "We will whip up the mob by getting up a candidate for president. When I get a hold of the Eastern papers," of course referring to the New York Tribune, "and see how popular I am afraid myself that I shall be elected." End quote. Now, it's clear to me that Joe delighted in his name being had for good and evil over all the nation. Press is press, and every national newspaper that carried his name was another like or retweet that made him more popular. Alexander Hamilton saw this failing in his very first Federalist paper, which is all more poignant in 1844, as Alexander Hamilton had only died the year before Joseph Smith was born, and, of course, the experiment of American democracy really had yet to prove itself. I offer a brief reading from Federalist Paper number 1 to illustrate his seemingly transcendent observations of what he calls demagoguery at one point. Quote, "Among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishments, and the perverted ambition of another class of men, who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies than from its union under one government. Ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more laudable than these are apt to operate as well upon those who support as those who oppose the right side of a question. Were there not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than the intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. For in politics, as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution." End quote. The various articles going out about the Mormons were generating fuel for that very persecution narrative, and that was dangerous. This was pointed out in a letter to the editor of the Quincy Whig, as the article published there only became more caustic towards Joseph Smith and the Mormons. The person had read the original article reprinted from the New York Tribune in the Quincy Whig, and that's the article that started our conversation today. And then this person read the editor's defense of publishing the article, which we just now read. These were this person's thoughts after consuming both articles, which were reprinted in the Times and Seasons in March 15th, 1844. The sentiments captured in this article are absolutely terrifying, and they illustrate the mind of many Mormons thinking that Joseph Smith would be their and the nation's savior. The ambitions for him to become king of the world were far from secret, even if the specific plans to make it happen were secret. Quote, "Mr. Editor, Sir, as I was perusing the Whig of the 28th of February last, my eye caught some remarks made by the editor of that paper justifying himself for publishing an article from the New York Tribune reflecting severely upon the Mormon leaders. I read the article alluded to, after which I made the following observations. I have heard it observed by medical gentlemen that if a person wish to commit suicide by taking poison, he will fail to accomplish his object if he take a very extravagant dose. For it being too strong for the stomach to retain, it meets with an immediate resistance and is thrown off before time will allow it to be conveyed to the blood. So with the article in the Whig. It is so strongly tinctured with the bane of falsehood, slander, and reproach that it can do the Mormons no harm. For every person who has been to Nauvoo and witnessed there the fruits of industry and untiring perseverance which exhibit themselves both in the city and on the widespread prairie must confess that the statements in the above-named article are false. They're fake news. The economy of Nauvoo is better than it's ever been. And how the editor should be ignorant of the fruits, I am at a loss to determine, for they have not grown in a corner. He is very jealous of religious and political power being united. But I would ask, does not every wise legislative body invoke the aid of a religious power to order their deliberations in wisdom and direct their political course with prudence? If not, why all these chaplains in our legislative halls and in the army and in the navy? I think that's a fantastic question. But probably the editor of the Whig would say, it is true in all Christian government, there are men selected of acknowledged worth and piety to ask wisdom upon the state and national councils, and also blessings upon the army and navy. Yet, says he, it is all a sham and mock ceremony. For if God were to give a revelation of wisdom and knowledge by the Holy Ghost or by an angel to any of these chaplains, and they should declare it in the national councils, it would not be regarded at all only as the height of extravagance, presumption, and folly. So you see, it is all a sham. Yes, Mr. Editor, your views are no doubt correct. They are too self-evident for me to contradict. But Joseph Smith, more sincere and consistent than they all, prays to God for wisdom, receives it by revelation, and then as a test of his implicit confidence therein acts upon it. Would the editor have us to understand that there is one department in heaven to guide the destinies of the political world and another directing the affairs of religion? If so, he is much mistaken. There is one God who presides over the destinies of all nations and individuals, both religiously and politically, and numbers the hairs of all our heads. I would ask if the editor of the Whig ever prays after the following manner: Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If he does, he virtually asks God to destroy the distinction of church and state on earth, for that distinction is not recognized in heaven. With God, politics and religion are both one, but not with us. He also prays that God may establish a government on the earth like that in heaven, and that the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. Church must not triumph over state, but actually swallow it up, like Moses' rod swallowed up the rods of the Egyptians. If this be not so, the kingdom of God can never come. Satan can never be bound. The millennial glory can never dawn upon our world. Christ can never reign King of nations as he now does King of saints. Neither can death be swallowed up in victory. But Christ will reign and put down all rule and authority and power. End quote. That is terrifying. Those, like the author of this editor, who fail to see the error of their ways simply baffle me. You can't have religious freedom if the nation in question is ruled by a specific religion, be that religion Mormonism, Catholicism, or Sharia law. Where do non-believers in Mormonism exist in this man's dystopic view of a Mormon nation? Where do non-believers have a place? There's an implicit mindset which informs this worldview that this person who wrote the letter to the editor of the Quincy Whig, there is this mindset that informs their worldview, and this is the second coming. The second coming will happen. Jesus will reign personally over the earth, and all non-believers or heretics will be burned up like chaff, and those tough questions like where do non-believers exist in a Mormon dystopia, those tough questions never need to be answered. Like some kind of magic cleansing fire. Everybody who isn't a true Christian is going to catch fire and burn into a pillar of salt or something. But because the second coming actually hasn't happened yet, every time somebody actually tries to build God's kingdom, that whole killing of heretics and non-believers thing is a duty that falls on the people actually building the kingdom. It's the people responsible for killing other people for not believing in the right God, whether those people be indigenous people of America refusing to convert to Christianity or Muslims in Iran, people successfully branded as terrorists. Religious purity requires cleansing the impure. That's why America's final frontier of rights must lay at the tattered bricks of the foundation of the church and state separation wall. Non-Mormons aren't allowed to live in a Mormon America, and that fact is just as much the case today as it was in 1844 when Joe was trying to actually build his literal Mormon American theocracy. This person continues to dig in their heels on this point. Quote, Whoever, therefore, will always labor to keep up a distinction of church and state must oppose his own prayers, fight against the decree of heaven, and perpetuate strife and confusion on earth. Whoever are to be the honored instruments in carrying forward the ark of this covenant and effecting this union, time must determine, whether the monks, the Methodists, or Mormons, or any of them, yet it will certainly be that people whom the Lord shall choose." End quote. That paragraph says a lot, doesn't it? America will be the Christian promised land, whether it be the monks, the Methodists, or the Mormons who build it. We will live in a Christian America. Anybody praying to God to save the world who maintains a wall of separation between church and state, quote, "perpetuates strife and confusion," end quote. Those people trying to keep the wall of separation up, those are apparently the hypocrites who can't be tolerated. Those are the moderates who unflinchingly give ground to radicals of their same creed. Final paragraph. "But to close, it may sometime happen to him who freely indulges in abusing a virtuous, industrious, and sincere people, a people who have been made poor by cruelty and oppression, a people who are trying to live by all a laudable industry, who have faced opposition in almost every form and waded through much tribulation, a people against whom the popular cry is raised, mingled with vengeance and extermination, and whose voice can seldom be heard in reply, that he fall into the same difficulties in which he tries to involve them, that he die in poverty and disgrace when no relatives can lament nor friends can bury. Signed, a friend to the Mormons." End quote. Now, this mentality, illustrated by this letter to the editor of the Quincy Whig, is infuriating to yours truly. It is absolutely maddening. The Mormon who wrote this is so quick to trot out the persecution complex and play victim, while simultaneously neglecting to realize he himself is the victim of Joseph Smith in the first place. Instead, he views the much tribulation which he suffered as a result of religious persecution instead of Joseph Smith being a monster. It's the same mentality that cries foul about 18 dead Mormons at Hans Mill, but still doesn't even add a footnote to a history book about the Timpanogos massacre and beheadings, the Bear River massacre, the Circleville massacre, and dozens of others, resulting in the unjustified death of thousands of indigenous people. Hamilton, in Federalist Paper 1, put it so well, quote, "A dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidden appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficacy of government. History will teach us that the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that those of men who have overturned the liberties of republic, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants." End quote. Joseph Smith was such a champion of liberty, fairer and more industrious than any other man. That's what Hamilton was afraid of. To quote from one of our articles today, "I have found him as familiar in the cabinet of nations as with his Bible, and in the knowledge of that book I have not met with his equal in Europe or America. Although if I should beg leave to differ with him in some items of faith, his nobleness of soul will not permit him to take offense at me. No, sir, I find him open, frank, and generous, as willing others should enjoy their opinions as to enjoy his own. He has learned that all-important lesson to profit by the experience of those who have gone before, so that, in short, General Smith begins where other men leave off." End quote. They begin their careers by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. Everything the Mormons suffered was because Joe's avarice to ascend to higher and higher offices of political, religious, and populist power. More tweets, more follows, more likes. The mind which created this response to the Quincy Whig that we read is some kind of warped, kind of like cult Stockholm syndrome that may be the sole longest lasting impact of Joe's legacy. These people were damaged by his actions, their perceptions of reality molded and shaped by the man profiting from their anguish. They cry oppression not when considering their own circumstances, but when people attack the man standing on top of their crushed freedoms and autonomy. The worst part about the entire article is he claimed the original New York Tribune article was full of falsehoods and misrepresentation. It wasn't. He said, quote, "It is so strongly tinctured with the bane of falsehood, slander, and reproach that it can do the Mormons no harm. For every person who has been to Nauvoo and witnessed there the fruits of industry and untiring perseverance, which exhibit themselves both in the city and in the widespread prairie, must confess that the statements in the above-named article are false." End quote. Fake news. The Nauvoo economy is better than it's ever been. Don't talk bad about my supreme leader, especially when he's done so much for us in the economy. But the two ordinances that it talked about, that original New York Tribune article talked about, the arresting power of the constable and the pardoning power being removed from the governor, and the other ordinance that they printed about Joe creating an alcohol monopoly, those were both real. There were no falsehoods in there. They've been printed in previous editions of the Times and Seasons pursuant to the Nauvoo Charter, which required public notice of any ordinances passed before they went into effect. As for this passage, quote, "Of the prophet himself, none who know him can respect him. They cannot respect him for his sincerity, for he cannot be sincere, for he cannot be the victim of his own delusion. They cannot esteem him for his piety, for he does not even profess to be pious, and he is notoriously the greatest blasphemer and railer in the country," end quote. Is that the slander and reproach that the person is talking about? Is that what they mean, that there's falsehoods and slanderous and reproach in the New York Tribune article? Those are all opinions. Now, the New York Times v. Sullivan, that's the standard Supreme Court case by which slander and freedom of speech cases are largely judged by, that wouldn't come along for another 100 years after this, but the sentiment predated the court ruling. These are opinion judgments. They're not statements of facts. For example, I can say that Russell M. Nelson deserves as much respect and adoration as an Alzheimer's-ridden Voldemort. He looks like a 3-year-old potato skin stretched over the skeleton of a lizard from a nuclear bomb testing site, and his brain is just Nickelodeon slime, and none of those statements are slanderous because they are personal opinions and gross exaggerations that no reasonable mind would construe as legitimate claims to fact. Now, that Mormon respondent to the New York Tribune article is just wrong in the factual assertions. But the thing is, and I want to dig into this, it's wrong on a deeper level. It began by saying that the article was too poisonous to have any real effect on the Mormons. Well, what it did do was further prejudice and shape the mind of the public towards Joseph Smith. A Times and Seasons article with a couple thousand readers responding to a New York Tribune article with a couple 100,000 readers has a greater impact on the mind and the public than can be easily measured. Right? Like a modern example, the Washington Post publishing the story that the Salt Lake City Church is hoarding over $100 billion, right? WAPO has a few million readers. The Deseret News Response has a few thousand regular readers. What was the impression that the public took away from the story? Does the public, in general, remember the Deseret News Response and the op-eds from the BYU professors who say that they're glad that the church has the money? Or that the church having so much money proves that it's a good steward over the kingdom of God? Or does the public at large remember the WAPO article about the $100 billion nest egg the Mormons are sitting on? I mean, you wonder where myths of dragons sitting on piles of gold originate. But needless to say, I mean, it's a matter of the general public perception, and whatever has the widest readership moves and shapes the minds, not the responses. And I guess to kind of summarize everything today, the media was having a field day with the Mormons in March of 1844. And it wasn't long before the dissenters reacting to the constant onslaught of scandals finally reacted in a way which proved fatal for the prophet and his closest advisor and personal sidekick. And speaking of Joe's sidekick, Hyrum Smith, Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff Smith was still caught up in litigation with Orsimus F. Bostwick concerning polygamy. As a review, Bostwick made allegations that Hyrum was practicing or was preaching polygamy, and Hyrum sued Bostwick for slander or defamation in Nauvoo. Dr. Robert Bob the Builder D. Foster acted as Bostwick's attorney. The case was dismissed because it was in the Nauvoo Municipal Court, and of course it was dismissed. Foster told Joseph Smith he was going to appeal the case to the circuit court in Carthage, which Joe let's just say he strongly advised Bob the Builder Foster against appealing the case. So with that little bit of review as a background with the Orson SF Bostwick and Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff Smith, with that background in place, Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff Smith published an incredibly fascinating article in the Times and Seasons. Quote, Nauvoo, March 15th, 1844. To the brethren of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints living on China Creek in Hancock County, greeting. Whereas Brother Richard Hewitt has called on me today to know my views concerning some doctrines that are preached in your place, and states to me that some of your elders say that a man having a certain priesthood may have as many wives as he pleases, and that doctrine is taught here. I say unto you that that man teaches false doctrine, for there is no such doctrine taught here, neither is there any such thing practiced here. Now, brief pause. We're going to read through the whole article, and then I'm going to tease it out point by point in just a second here. And any man that is found teaching privately or publicly any such doctrine, polygamy, is culpable and will stand a chance to be brought before the High Council and lose his license and membership also. Therefore, he had better beware what he is about. And again, I say unto you, an elder has no business to undertake to preach mysteries in any part of the world. Mysteries in any part of the world. For God has commanded us all to preach nothing but the first principles unto the world. Neither has any elder any authority to preach any mysterious thing to any branch of the church, unless he has a direct commandment from God to do so. Let the matter of the grand councils of heaven and the making of gods, worlds, and devils entirely alone. Grand councils of heaven, the making of gods, worlds, and devils. Leave it alone. For you are not called to teach any such doctrine, for neither you nor the people are capacitated to understand any such principles, lest so teach them. For when God commands men to teach such principles, the saints will receive them. Therefore, beware what you teach. For the mysteries of God are not given to all men, and unto those to whom they are given, they are placed under restrictions to impart only such as God will command them. And the residue is to be kept in a faithful breast, otherwise he will be brought under condemnation. By this God will prove his faithful servants, who will be called and numbered with the chosen. And as to the celestial glory, all will enter in and possess that kingdom that obey the gospel, and continue in faith in the Lord unto the end of days. Now, therefore, I say unto you, you must cease preaching your miraculous things, and let the mysteries alone until by and by. Preach faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, repentance of baptism for the remission of sins, the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost, teaching the necessity of strict obedience unto these principles, reasoning out of the Scriptures, proving them unto the people. Cease your schisms and divisions and your contentions. Humble yourselves as in dust and ashes, lest God should make an example of you of his wrath unto the surrounding world. Amen. In the bonds of the everlasting covenant, I am your obedient servant, Hyrum Smith. End quote. This article is amazing. First off, this was not the usual categorical denial of the practice of polygamy, and that is a remarkable shift in the narrative from the multiple previous denials of polygamy over the prior decade. Notably, this article that I just read from Hyrum Smith was removed from the History of the Church version that was published in the early 20th century. Only by Dan Vogel's Source and Text Critical Edition has this article been restored from the original manuscript drafts and placed in his Source and Text Critical Edition in bold text. Why? Why was this article removed? Why was it published by Hyrum Smith in the first place? What does the article really mean? I believe the reason that it was removed from the original version, the original edition of the history of the church, alludes to the original purpose of publishing it in the first place, which allows us to peek into what it really meant when it was published in March of 1844. First, it talks about a man, quote, having a certain priesthood, end quote, preaching about having as many wives as he pleases. Now, this is true because the sealing power of the new and everlasting covenant in Mormon parlance, that was still in its early prototype phases right now. Sealing power was something that was manufactured by Joseph Smith to control who could preach and practice polygamy and who was allowed to actually take wives. By Joe's own direction in the July 1843 revelation, which is Modern Doctrine and Covenants 132, it declares that only he has the power of sealing in the quote-unquote new and everlasting covenant. That's polygamy, right? However, many men had taken many women as polygamous wives by July of 1843 when that sealing power was created. And the distinctions between spiritual wifery practiced by dozens of elites and new and everlasting covenant practiced only under Joe's approval, those lines really had yet to be defined. So Joe created his own priesthood of sealing power, and he alone had control over what polygynous relationships were approved of. Then the article that Hyrum Smith published, it denies that any such thing is going on in Nauvoo, and any man who is found preaching such things is liable to be brought in before the High Council for a tribunal and to lose his preaching license. Now, while that chunk of the passage reads as a blatant denial, when taken into context of what is said in the next paragraph, the statement becomes a bit more nuanced. However, before getting into that, reading just between the lines of just that statement, this means that anybody who's preaching polygamy without approval will be disciplined. Only our approved short list of men can preach mysteries. And if you're not on that list and you're preaching polygamy, you're putting all of us in danger. So on the next line, it says, quote, an elder has no business to undertake to preach mysteries in any part of the world, for God has commanded us all to preach nothing but the first principles unto the world. Neither has any elder any authority to preach any mysterious thing to any branch of the church unless he has a direct commandment from God to do so. Unless he has a direct commandment from God to do so. That says a lot. It finishes by saying, let the matter of the ground councils of heaven and the making of gods, worlds, and devils entirely alone, end quote. That sentence contextualizes the previous lines. Only those who we approve of can preach mysteries. Now, the doctrine of exaltation, becoming gods with planets, grand councils of heaven, all of these are super deep Mormon doctrine, and all of them are tied to polygamy somehow. How does one ascend to become a god? Well, by taking at least 3 wives. How does one make planets? Well, by forming them out of matter and then populating them with spirit children from one's multiple wives. How does one enter into the grand councils of heaven? Well, by becoming a god, and we'll see the above answers. These are the greatest mysteries of Mormon theology, the mysteries repeatedly alluded to in the article Hyrum Smith published here. And anybody preaching these deeper points of doctrine, these mysteries, couldn't do so without at very least leaving the door open for the mystery of the new and everlasting covenant, polygamy. Now, why this is just a very, very brief pause, because this is providing a forecast into the next few episodes. Why this was on a lot of people's mind was because of the King Follett discourse. Joseph Smith had spun together this fantastic discourse on what was considered the deepest realm of Mormon theology. And, well, we're going to go through it in the next few episodes. And how we're going to discuss it is really by teasing apart what the buzzwords were being used in order to say much more to the Mormons than what was actually being said and written by the people who were just observing and writing it down. Well, like I said, the next few episodes we're going to be doing a series on the King Follett discourse. We're going to go we're going to talk an entire episode about King Follett himself, his impact on Mormon history, as well as his family, how he died. And then we're going to get into an entire deconstruction of the King Follett discourse itself, which, if you don't know about it, it is one of the greatest pieces of Joseph Smith preaching sermons that we have record of. So, like I said, just a little bit of forecasting. So back into the Hyrum Smith article, right? The next line is, honestly, it's the most revealing of the entire article. Quote, "For when God commands men to teach such principles, the saints will receive them." End quote. What that means is it leaves the door wide open to declare polygamy publicly from the pulpit at a later time. There is simply no other way to deal with that line, and there's no other reason for it to be in there in the first place. But to further illustrate my point, it continues from there. "Therefore, beware what you teach, for the mysteries of God are not given to all men, and unto those to whom they are given, they are placed under restrictions to impart only such as God will command them." End quote. The mysteries, the new and everlasting covenant, are placed under strict restriction, and only the men who God commands can teach them. Quote, "By this God will prove his faithful servants who will be called and numbered with the chosen." End quote. Will you be one of the chosen, faithful reader of the times and seasons? Will you believe everything that we tell you, but only when we choose to tell you? Will you obey? Will you believe when God commands men to teach such principles and mysteries that the saints will receive them? Will you believe? Another point in there, quote, "And as to the celestial glory," new and everlasting covenant, polygamy, making gods, making kingdoms, making worlds, "and as to the celestial glory, all will enter in and possess that kingdom and obey the gospel and continue in faith in the Lord unto the end of days. Now, therefore, I say unto you, you must cease preaching your miraculous things and let the mysteries alone until by and by." End quote. Let the mysteries alone until all the chips are down, all the ducks in the row, and all the puzzle pieces fall where they must. We'll teach polygamy and exaltation to godhood when the time is right. And then the article ends with a threat. Quote, "Humble yourselves as in dust and ashes, lest God should make you an ensample of his wrath unto the surrounding world." End quote. That wasn't just a public statement. That wasn't some ethereal, transcendent power, a threat of God's wrath. This is a deliberate warning to anybody who may disobey. The wrath of God in the Nauvoo kingdom was a tangible reality to those who became a threat to the church in any way. The will and wrath of God was exercised by his most faithful and elect, who appear like a thief in the night. When I opened this episode by saying the Mormon propaganda machine was in full force, I meant it. The Nauvoo Mormon propaganda was a versatile machine, and it had its ways of controlling narrative outside the church looking in, as much as the internal mechanisms, like who could and couldn't preach the mysteries of the kingdom. 1844 was a big year for the church leadership under Joseph Smith. With so many moving parts, a lot of decisions were constantly in the air. A lot of levers needed pulling before another lever could be pulled. But one thing I'm relatively certain of is this, and it's that had Joseph Smith not died in 1844, it would have been within the following 2 years after that he would have led the Mormons on their next mass exodus outside the boundaries of the United States government and openly started practicing polygamy, just like Bloody Brigham Young had done by 8 years after this very article was published by Hyrum Sidekick-Abiff Smith. All of the headlines and the national attention turning towards the Mormons, it forced Joe to calculate many complex forces into his equations. But his ultimate goal of moving away from the boundaries of any law enforcement, that was kind of at the top of his to-do list. Why? So he could flaunt the laws with impunity. and finally build his theocratic empire with his harem of wives and armies of thousands. That fateful evening in the Carthage jail shaped American history, and with little signals in the historical record like Hyrum's article here, as well as the respondent to the Quincy Whig about the New York Tribune article, I can't help but wonder how the world might be different if Carthage jail had never happened. That's going to do it for our main segment today. As I told you during the main episode, or the main segment, I should say, next up on the chopping block is the King Follett Discourse. I just picked up the biography of King Follett, which is the man behind the discourse, a relatively recently published book, and all of the large history outlets left glowing reviews of this book. So I'm going to consume it and bring to you an episode about King Follett, the man behind the discourse, basing much of it off of that book. And then we're going to go through a systematic review of the actual King Follett discourse. Now, we did read the whole thing in totality on the My Book of Mormon podcast. That was Marie and I just kind of going through it, reading through the different transcriptions and different versions of people who were in the audience who transcribed it during one of the two times that it was given from top to bottom by Joseph Smith. We compare it with the published version versus the notes taken by the people who were writing it down at the time. It was a really interesting episode, but we really didn't dive deep into the genesis and the originations of some of the doctrines, where they came from, how they kind of evolved to become Joseph Smith's theology, and we didn't really discuss the impact of the King Follett discourse. So that is going to be our next set of episodes. We're beginning that series as our first episode of February, and I have a sneaking suspicion it's probably going to take us 3 to 4 episodes to get through the whole thing, just because the thing is packed. It's quite a discourse, and it really it's a large treatise on Joseph Smith's late theology in the last couple months of his life. And we spend very little time on this podcast about Mormon theology, even though it is a Mormon podcast. So we spend most of our time talking about history, and it's amazing how much you can discuss Mormon history without talking any of the theology. But the next series, the next few episodes, we are going to dive a bit into the history of King Follett, as well as the theology that's revealed in the discourse that was given as his funeral sermon. So with that, we do have a couple of new patrons to thank. First, we have a pledge by Anug, A-N-U-G, Anug, maybe. I like that. Maybe it's a nug. And we also have a new pledge by TJ. So with new pledges, as well as the typical fluctuation of pledges and deletions and people's credit cards expiring and everything, that leaves us at minus $1 an episode from last week. So if you want to pledge to support the show, get a whole bunch of extra content, please do so at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You not only get an extended edition of every new episode, but you also get an extra episode every week. And what we've been reading through lately is the main expose, like the biggest, greatest, earliest expose of Mormonism. Mormonism Unveiled. We just now finished that book. So next week's patron exclusive episode is going to just be kind of Mormonism Unveiled in review. That's what we've been doing for the Patreon episodes, is reading through these old Mormon books, because they are just so important, and they're often cited by historians in their biographies of Joseph Smith or their historiographies of Mormonism in general, or certain topics of Mormonism. Well, it's kind of fun to dive into the entire text, read it through top to bottom, and I give my commentary as well. 19 chapters, all 19 chapters are done. We've done 20 episodes on it. Episode 21 of Mormonism Unveiled is just going to be my final thoughts, the impact, the long-term ramifications of Mormonism Unveiled. And then we are beginning a new NAMO book in our NAMO book club. And I'm actually kind of throwing out some a petition for suggestions, right? I have a few in mind that I'm thinking we could do. Maybe we could read Manuscript Story, the Spalding manuscript that was discovered at Oberlin College. Maybe we can read View of the Hebrews top to bottom. I've never read either of those books in their entirety. I've only read citations to them. Or maybe we could read a more contemporary book that's a little shorter, like the Joseph H. Jackson expose, which was really important in 1844. Whatever. Hey, do you have any suggestions? Let me know. Comment on this on the Patreon feed or by tagging me on Facebook or Twitter, and let us know if there's a specific book that you would like to hear read top to bottom with my commentary in basically audiobook form on the Patreon exclusive feed. And if you want to listen to those, of course, go sign up at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We also have an event coming up. This is going to be April 19th, 2020. This is Bicycle Day 2020. I'm going to be giving a talk on the entheogenic origins of Mormonism, and we're going to be doing a walking tour of the Gilgal Gardens. So I'm calling this, because it's like, psilocybin, the Silgal Gardens, right? So we're going to go through a bit of the Smith entheogen theory, open it up instead of just me lecturing you for 3 episodes about the Smith entheogen theory, kind of have more of a dynamic conversation. And then we're going to do a walking tour of this little gem that's hiding in downtown Salt Lake City, known as Gilgal Gardens, and I'm really looking forward to it. If you want to attend the event, you can find information for tickets and everything in the show notes of this week's episode, or by going to psychevents.com. That is PSYCHEVENTS, psychevents.com, and you can find access to the meetup group, the Utah Psychedelic Society, there, and you can join the group if you would like to get a discount on the ticket, or you can just purchase the tickets outright there. You can also get a VIP ticket that includes dinner with myself as well as the organizers afterwards. We mentioned this on the 3rd episode of the Smith entheogen theory, reading through the actual paper that was recently published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. And I invited one of the organizers of the Utah Psychedelic Society on to tell us a bit about the event and about their group. So if you're interested in joining their group or coming to the event, once again, psychevents.com, or you can check in the show notes to find the event for the Bicycle Day 2020 event that's coming up. And if you already have tickets, there are some tickets left. So if you already have your tickets, I look forward to seeing you there. If not, you might want to snap them up quick, because I'm not sure how much longer tickets are going to be available. Of course, this is the last time I'm going to remind you in January. I'm going to remind you one more time in February, and then a couple of times in March right before the event comes up. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the episode for today. Of course, I want to thank you all so much for sticking in, for hanging out here, for all the housekeeping and the announcements and everything, and the Patreon plugs, of course. It really means a lot to me. And more importantly, you hit download and you listen to the entire show, particularly the history, which is what you come to this show for. So for that, I want to thank you for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2020, all rights reserved.